Nathan, will you introduce yourself, say what you want to say about yourself, and then...
Yeah, sure. So I'm Nathan. I'm pretty involved with Extinction Rebellion, so that's how, I suppose was why I'm here. I know Tony and a few others. And so what I am going to be talking about today is sort of intergenerational tension or justice, whatever you might want to call it, from the context of climate change. I'm 36. So in early 1988, when I was 5, the UN established its climate body to reduce carbon emissions, urging action on emissions in order to avoid catastrophic consequences. That happened when I was 5. Then in 1990, when I was 8, the UN produced its first report on climate change, urging action and warning of the catastrophic consequences of business as usual. And in 1995, when I was 13, the UN produced its second report, urging action and warning of the catastrophic consequences of business as usual. And in 2001, shortly after I was eligible to vote for the first time, the IPCC produced its third report, urging action and warning of the catastrophic consequences of business as usual. And you can probably see where I'm going with that. So as I was learning to crawl and walk and read and write and learn and dance and love, and as I was being taught what I needed to do for my future, that future was being crafted for me kind of silently and unknown by the failure really of my parents' generation. Probably the complete failure, if I'm honest and provocative. And I think by their inaction, and by their complacency, and even at times probably by their cowardice, they've created a future for me, and certainly for people younger than me, the kids that were marching last week. They've created a future where choices have been taken away from them. So they're now having to react to a set of very real physical circumstances that are only present because of the failure of their parents' generation. And so choices have been taken away from them, and now they're forced to react in a certain way. And there's some injustice in that, I think. But the thing is, even though the UN said that if business as usual carried on, we'd have catastrophic consequences, so through my formative years, my parents' generation were told business as usual equals catastrophic consequences, but business didn't carry on as usual. It was actually worse than that, right? So business boomed, carbon emissions boomed, forests were cut down and species went extinct, fueled, ironically enough, by the boomers, who seemed to have wanted everything that they could basically get their hands on. So, they wanted second homes and third homes, and they wanted new stuff, and they wanted foreign holidays, and they wanted to go first class, and they wanted fat pensions, stuff with fossil fuels. They didn't really care as long as the money was coming in, or would come in when they could nicely retire. They wanted vanity business trips, they wanted IKEA, they wanted quinoa, blueberries from California, kiwis from New Zealand. They wanted stuff. And, perhaps worse than the lies that they were telling themselves about the normality of that living mode, or the sustainability, if you want to call it that, about the way that they were living, worse, I think, than the lies they were telling themselves was the truth they weren't telling my generation, the millennials. As we are known, that truth, that mode of living is anything but normal. It's not sustainable. There's nothing normal about it. And I think that, they knew this deep down. I think it's really hard to look at the way that the system that has now been created demands resource extraction and demands our consumption, and to look at that and think it's normal. I think that deep down people know that's not normal, and I think that's what's now bubbling to the surface, this sense that, okay, yeah, we're kind of screwing things up and we need to change. But there's another injustice in that, is that it's kind of, there were boomers, of course, that kind of could have everything and anything they wanted at whatever time they wanted, but it was only if they could really afford it. And so what we saw through that period, kind of through that Thatcher-Reagan consensus, was an explosion of inequality as well. So you have now a society that's arguably more unequal than ever, and over the last 10 to 15 years we've had this sort of insane austerity drive at the same time as we've got a richer society than we've ever had financially, but the costs of that boom have been placed very much on the shoulders of those who can kind of least bear it. So that's sort of an added injustice on top of the fact that the physical world is collapsing. But just back to climate, so since 1988, when I was 5 and the UN established its climate change body to reduce emissions, more carbon dioxide has been emitted since that time than in all of human history before then. So it's sort of, you know, a complete catastrophic failure of that generation to do what it said it needed to do, which is to kind of control carbon emissions, because otherwise we're going to be in the situation that we are now. And as I said, it runs from climate to austerity, but it runs to housing. You know, pay too much rent. We all pay too much rent if you don't own your house. If you can even find a place to live, that is. To opportunity, to the rise of tax havens. You know, even to the rise of the far right. You know, why are we seeing a resurgent far right and a white supremacist ideology? There's something deeply regressive about that, and it speaks to a set of conditions that I don't really feel like I've created, and certainly people younger than me in this room created, but I think it's certainly a set of conditions that were created by, you know, my parents' generation. And there's another element to this too, which I think is that there were elements of the left that kind of looked at the Thatcher-Reagan victory and that consensus that was created and just kind of gave up. They just kind of thought, well, you know, we tried, we've lost, and they retreated into kind of factionalism and indulged defeatist tendencies, or just kind of denied really at that point that they had any agency. So, you know, the alternative ideology had won. There were a lot of people that left the Labour Party because of that turn towards neoliberalism under Blair, either left it just to kind of sort of not really be as engaged, or joined the Green Party. That, with the best will in the world at that time, the Green Party was never going to be a force for political power, and it's arguable if it's that force today. It's arguable. I think it's probably difficult to argue that it is a force for political power. So you had a left that kind of gave up, and there was a takeover of culture and ethics by a corporate culture which itself was devoid of ethics, and this happened on the watch of the older generation. Now, some older people would say that that's not kind of fair, and that they were always fighting, and well, it might be true, but you lost. So yeah, you lost, and the forces that were ranged against the forces of progressivism were multitudinous, and collectively the magnitudes of those forces were more powerful. That's obvious and undeniable, but I still find it difficult to swallow as an excuse, because those actually are the condition. Those are revolutionary conditions. So, you know, the logic of momentous change can't exist without something hugely more powerful pushing down against it. And being generous, you might argue that those conditions are only now at a point where we can have that revolutionary change, but certainly for the last 30 years I would say that they've existed, and rather than seize that moment for change, you know, the left decided that it wasn't up for the fight, basically. That's kind of it, really, I suppose. I mean, once the systems are established and they're up and running and that architecture is then there and people are operating and flowing through the system, it becomes really hard to rein it in. And the more that architecture is layered up with some of those really nefarious ethics and insidious kind of ideologies, the more it feeds on itself. And so now we're at a point where we have an incredibly toxic system that's been layered up, and it probably is at a breaking point, and it, you know, kind of falls to the younger generation, but also the older generation too, to try and fix it. And that's where I find some modicum of hope, is that I do feel that older people have kind of realised that they've maybe screwed things up a little bit, and so they're getting perhaps more active than they've ever been in order to perhaps right those wrongs, and try and at least show that they understood that they've learned from some of those failures. And I think one of the interesting things about Extinction Rebellion is that one of the co-founders, Roger Hallam, is a granddad, you know, and he's studying a PhD looking into how effectively system change happens. And you know, he's been quite honest that, you know, his generation has failed. You know, he was been involved in stuff that hasn't worked. He made a joke. Dinero and I went to Bristol, and he made a joke about how it's now time for, you know, the hippies to show the discipline that they've never shown. And I think, you know, and so I think there is clearly something happening as well with the older generation. So I don't want it to be kind of seen as a, you know, I don't want it to be divisive, and I don't think it has to be if the older generation are really kind of dedicated to looking truthfully at the situation that they've had a large hand in creating and trying to do something to put it right. So yeah, that's it.
Thanks.